Welcome to this week's edition of Good Books Radio. Audiobooks.com is the chief underwriter for Good Books Radio, which is produced by UTRGV Media Services for Rio Grande Valley Public Radio. And now, here's your host, Dr. John Cook.
Welcome once again to another edition of Good Books Radio. I'm your host this week, Dr. John Cook, and with me today is Mr. John G. West, who's an author and documentary filmmaker who lives in the Pacific Northwest. His books and films include The Magician's Twin, Darwin Day in America, the C.S. Lewis Reader's Encyclopedia, The Politics of Revelation and Reason, Firemaker, Revolutionary, and Darwin's Heretic. He's a former university professor and currently serves as a vice president of Discovery Institute and an associate director of the Center for Science and Culture. And what we have today is a really captivating book that offers a comprehensive look at Disney's live productions. This is entitled Walt Disney and Live Action. Mr. West, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
This is researched thoroughly. I can see that from the detail that's written into those chapters that I read with reckless abandon, because Disney was my life. I mean, he came about in the 50s and 60s when I was growing up as a kid, and he impacted my life in an awful lot of ways. So this is like a paperback edition. The original version came out before. Is that correct?
There was an earlier version, about 20 years ago, but this is expanded and has some archival photos from the Library of Congress that have never been published before, and so I was really happy that the new press, Theme Park Press, was willing to bring out a new edition, new expanded edition.
In the introduction, you talk about some of the people who were critical of him, Ray Bradbury being one, a science fiction writer, the man you loved to hate or hated to love. Well, what is that about?
Actually, Ray Bradbury loved Walt Disney, but he was commenting on people who were dissing him, we'll say. So there, like someone, actually Times film critic for many years, Richard Schickel, wrote a book called The Disney Version at the end of the 1960s. It got redone in the 1980s, where he was just thought that Disney was a pernicious influence, commercial influence, that he focused too much on good versus evil stories, that, on and on and on and on. And so Ray Bradbury was pointing out that a lot of people thumbed their noses at Disney and sort of looked down on him as just a simpleton. And actually, Ray Bradbury was not one of those. He actually very much respected Disney.
You mentioned Schickel's book a lot in the opening introduction, and apparently he was not fond of Disney and accused him of being a tyrant and all kinds of horrible characteristics. A rather grim assessment of Disney, even in his films. And that's so surprising to me. I didn't know that anyone was a critic of Disney.
Well, there's a cottage industry in America, and especially in the entertainment industry, of sort of tell-all books and trying to tear people down afterwards, and often they're true, but sometimes they're not. And so in the case of Disney, there's been a cottage industry. Schickel sort of started off, but then there was a series of biographies. A guy named Mark Elliott wrote a biography. All tried to top each other with trying to say horrible things about Disney. So I became intrigued by this when I was going to grad school for my PhD in political science, and I was living in Southern California at the time, and I decided, this was in the 1990s, many of the people who work for Disney are still alive, and so I decided to start interviewing them. And so I talked to about 24 people who interviewed them, and I also decided to focus, maybe, why not write something sort of on the side while I was doing my PhD on Disney's live-action films and productions, because of all the things he does. He was a polymath. He had his animated films, he had his theme parks. The thing, though, that probably gets the least amount of attention are his live-action films and television productions, yet they were influential on the raising of generations in America, for good or bad, and I thought they were a lot more worthwhile than many people were thinking. And so that's sort of how the genesis of this book came about. And then I started to interview people one by one who worked with him, and then they would pass me along to someone else. And that was a fascinating experience. And, I would ask them, so did Disney have a dark side? Was he a tyrant? Was he a racist? Was he this or that? And they would share very honestly, and really to a person, they were very complimentary towards Disney. Now, Disney was obviously strong-minded. He was very creative. He could, he made his views clear, but he also treated people with a lot of respect and kindness, and was just a joy to be around because he was so creative. Sometimes it was hard to keep up with him, and that could be intimidating, but not because he was evil or not because he was treating people with disrespect. He was a person of his time, so some of his views back 50, 60, 70 years ago might not be views that you have today, but for his time, he was remarkably prejudice-free and remarkably, pretty much far-thinking about a variety of things, from the environment to things like immigration to, you name it. He was pretty much on the political side more conservative, very free market-oriented, but he also was very defending the importance of tolerance for people and equality for all people, and so he was this very interesting mixture. So it was fun.
Interesting character, and I think about some of the live action productions that he made. As a kid, I was hypnotized by Zorro. I never missed an episode of Zorro, and Mary Poppins is possibly one of the most impactful films he ever did, and just amazing what he was able to do with animation in a time long before there was digital animation. There are so many people who have held him up as a role model, and that includes the Errol Flynn's and the Frank Capras and the modern producers, the Spielbergs and the Lucases. What was this quality that he had that made him such a creative spirit at such an early age in movie making?
That is a really great question. I'm not quite sure how to say it. I think we're all unique individuals. Certainly, I think in one sense, his growing up in the Midwest in a pretty impoverished environment, his family was not particularly successful. His dad was not particularly successful. And so they sort of scraped by. And that sort of forced him to go into the world of his imagination, to make life meaningful. And so in some respect, I think it may be true that his impoverished background actually helped spur him to do some things that if he had been born in the lap of luxury, he might not have done. Mm-hmm. He, I know, always thanked one of his aunts for really encouraging him to start doodling and start doing art, because, again, his dad, he had a really troubled relationship with his dad. His dad was not a particularly sympathetic character, didn't really understand his son, didn't really value his interest in art. So I think that he did have some family members, like his aunt, who did encourage that. His older brother Roy was very helpful in sort of providing someone who is more sympathetic, a male figure who is more sympathetic than his dad.
Oh yeah, your treatment of Roy was really great. I found myself appreciating him very much from what you talked about in the book. That's good.
Yeah, and that came from Disney. Disney, fortunately, later in life did talk a lot about various things, and so he gave some poignant speeches where he talked about Roy and his brother confessor, as he said, who would stick up for him. And frankly, if Roy hadn't existed, probably Walt Disney's film studio wouldn't have existed, because Roy was basically always tasked to find the funding for his brother's crazy ideas. Mm-hmm. And for the most part, he did. They had some falling out on various things, but for the most part, they were very close. And Roy was very protective of his younger brother and made Walt Disney Productions and the studio really possible.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about some of the directors. Robert Stevenson did an awful lot for the Disney lot and really admired his boss fiercely. What are some of the films that Stevenson did that we would recognize?
Well, of course, the biggest one would be Mary Poppins.
Mm-hmm.
He also, what Robert Stevenson really enjoyed, and many of these people, I mean, Robert Stevenson, Bob Stevenson had died by the time I came around to do this book, but I read many transcripted interviews with him. And he had this distinguished background, actually had worked in the film industry for a long time in Britain, elsewhere. One of the early really strong versions of Jane Eyre with John Houseman and others that he helped put together. So he was a very distinguished director, but he sort of felt he was stuck in a rut, and Disney gave him the chance to do some fantasy comedies, among other things, like The Absent-Minded Professor and Son of Flubber, which were phenomenally popular in America, and he always thanked Disney for actually seeing that he could also direct comedies. And so he ended up directing a lot of other things too.
Let's not deny Love Bug and Bedknobs and Broomsticks and The Shaggy DA. I mean, there were a lot of great flicks that he did, and he talks about something that you mentioned in the book in a couple of places, and that is Walt Disney, although he had multiple projects going all the time, had an amazing power of focus. If he was focused on a particular project, that was what he talked about. And he was detail-oriented at a level that I'm just surprised by.
And many of his writers would say the same thing. So, for example, Disney, although he was basically the producer, so he wasn't the scriptwriter, wasn't the director, he would go line by line over every script. He'd sometimes act out entirely new scenes. They'd have story conferences. Actually, there's another facet of Disney that he really gave to Hollywood. His whole process of making films, of detailed story conferences, of storyboarding on sort of in picture level the script, so that you could actually think what sets you need to build, what do we want to see on screen, is something that both Spielberg and Lucas, among others, ended up using to good effect. And so his whole process, and he would go, like I said, line by line in his thick grease pencil and take things out, add things. I had one writer tell me, Disney would remember when we were watching the Daily Rushes that if something wasn't working, he would remember a line from, the fourth version of the script, way back months ago that had either been left out or that needed to be plugged back in, or, he had just a phenomenal memory for things.
Mm-hmm. And he also, some people portrayed him as a tyrant, but the truth is he would discuss an issue and hear all points of view, but once it was decided, you better not revisit the issue, right?
No. Multiple people said the same thing. He obviously had strong views. He wanted to keep things moving because he was doing multiple projects at a time, but he really did want multiple views, and some of the people he ended up most appreciating were those who would argue with him. But once the decision was made, he didn't want to revisit it ad infinitum, and he would get pretty peeved if you did that. But generally, they didn't do that.
Mm-hmm. Were there people that he saw as his favorites? I mean, it seems like Fred MacMurray got a lot of work thanks to Walt Disney.
He did. I mean, this is one of the things that did develop his sort of stock company, and other people had that too. If you watch Frank Capra's films, over the years he ended up having actors and actresses that he ended up reusing several times. And so, Disney did do that. One of the interesting things I found out from a couple different people, and some who are deceased, who I read transcripted interviews, others who were live, is that a lot of the script writers, to get Disney really interested in the script, they would end up writing Disney's personal characteristics into the main characters. And so when you're watching, say, Mr. Banks in Mary Poppins, or various characters, particularly played by Fred MacMurray, you're seeing some personal characteristics of Walt Disney, because some of the scriptwriters and producers, they would put Disney's personal characteristics in there. As they said, actually, it would get Disney more interested in the script, because, that character's really real.
Mm-hmm.
And so, Disney did like Fred MacMurray in particular, and I think Fred MacMurray was liked partly because he was a very decent guy, both in his personal life, and Disney really, Disney had this Midwestern background of an ordinary guy, and so he liked people like that because he could identify with them. And actually, frankly, he resurrected Fred MacMurray's career. Fred MacMurray was extremely grateful to Disney and the studio because by the time of the 1950s came around, he was stuck doing bad guys and westerns, and really his career was on the way out. And when Disney chose him for the Shaggy Dog, this really frankly, cheaply done film. It was originally filmed for TV, but then they decided to release it to theaters. It was a phenomenal success, and it just parlayed a whole new career and a whole new side of him, and he became in demand even by other studios on some other things. So Disney single-handedly resurrected Fred's career, and Fred was really grateful for that.
You talk about his Midwestern values, and one of the things that you discuss in the book is that Walt did not believe in mixing religion and entertainment. He wasn't one for making biblical epics like Cecil B. DeMille, but there were scenes where people are shown praying or clergymen are depicted in positive roles, and so there was, some core values that got reflected, even though he wasn't focused on that, but focused on preaching.
Yeah. He certainly wasn't focused on preaching, but it is amazing how much religion as a theme, as a social force, was a theme throughout his productions, and I think most people don't really recognize that. So from more obscure things that I love, Scarecrow of Romney Marsh, which was this great set in Britain of this actually pastor who ends up running smugglers in order to help poor people in Britain under King George, because the poor people are oppressed and they're starving. And so he basically leads them in a Robin Hood, Zorro type character, but actually with a darker cast and that was in the 1960s. One of the great British productions of Disney. Was also on TV, but they also released it in the theaters in Europe. But, time and again, whether it be Swiss Family Robinson or Summer Magic or you name it, there are clergymen or praying or, some theme of faith. Pretty much it's the social influence of faith as a moral force in the community, as is a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
Now, one of the more explicit that really does revolve around faith of both the negative and positive aspects is Pollyanna.
Yes.
And I think this is one of the great Americana films, and it's one of the greatest Disney live-action productions directed by David Swift. Frankly, the book Pollyanna is pretty slight. The film, in my version, in my view, is much better. I mean, this is a case of where Hollywood actually made something more substantial out of a pretty slight book. And one of the main things is the role of the minister in the community and whether he's just going to be the appendage of basically the wealthiest person in the community or whether it's going to be an independent moral force. And it's a really interesting story and a really wonderful picture of early 1900s America. I mean, it's just a really loving depiction of that, of both the foibles and the downsides of small towns, but also the real strong points too. And also Disney's themes of, Disney was a critic of the modern welfare state, and one of the themes in Pollyanna is the importance of private charity, but that charity that actually treats individuals not as dependent or as victims, but as that everyone, from the poorest of the poor to the disabled, have something to contribute and should be treated with respect and not sort of looked down upon. Mm-hmm. And it's really, I encourage anyone who hasn't seen it to see it, because it's just a wonderful film and just a wonderful recreation of a different time and place in American history.
I found the details interesting of the live-action production studio. There's this place in Burbank on Buena Vista Street that he built his live-action films upon. Although he acquired it in the 40s, until the late 50s, he really was producing other places. I mean, he made all but 2 of his productions in Britain, and so they didn't require detail. But when he made 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, I think that's when he started to use the Burbank facility to produce the live-action stuff that made him famous.
Yeah, I mean, he first started to do things in Britain live action basically because post-World War II, Britain froze a lot of their assets of international companies that had made money there because they were just so economically hard up. And so in order to do something with those assets, Disney had to actually film things in England. And so we got probably the best of those was actually Treasure Island, which is, I think, still the definitive cinematic version of that story.
Mm-hmm.
And Disney had this constellation of, but then you're right. So then when he decided to get in and realize that live action could be profitable and that they could do something interesting with it, then he began to build out the Disney Studio sound stages and then a wonderful back lot. One of the untold things that was just a joy to me was the number of professionals that Disney attracted around him, not just directors, but things like set decorator, Emile Curie. He's now dead, but one of my most intriguing times was spending the day with him and his wife. And Emile Curie actually was a set decorator for Frank Capra on It's a Wonderful Life. He was a set decorator on several Hitchcock films. He was an A-list set decorator of Lebanese extraction, so a really interesting character ethnically and in his personal life story, and was one of Disney's closest people. Would go on private trips with Disney and his wife, so it was one of the few people who really socialized with Disney, of Disney's employees. And he came for 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and then stayed and built a whole set decoration department. And he was just a brilliant guy, and it was just fascinating to listen to his stories.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, my book is basically the only place no one else ever talked to him before he died. And so he just had these wonderful stories of including going to Disney at Disneyland, where Disney would do some fun things for when he saw orphans coming in with Catholic nuns. He thought, well, how could they afford to come here? And he'd go and refund their money and treat them to lunch, and just these amazing private stories that you never really think about.
Amazing stuff. I want to talk about the berms they built, because it amazes me that they created these lots and planted these trees to create locations all over the world for the action films. That's in this small back lot with mounds of dirt.
That was the brainchild of Robert Clatworthy, an art director, another distinguished art director who had a lot of pre-Disney credits, and he thought, in order to create the atmosphere without a lot of sound and extraneous sounds and things, of building these mounds, basically this earthen wall, and planting trees on them that would surround sort of the Disney back lot. People can experience the same things when they go to Disneyland. When they walk into, there is a berm around Disneyland for sort of the same reason, to make it its own little kingdom. So you go through onto Main Street USA in Disneyland, you're actually walking through this earthen wall that was designed to sort of create its own little entity. Well, that's what they did for the Disney back lot, and it made it tremendously useful up until the 1980s when they tore it down.
Mm-hmm. Well, the names go on and on here. I mean, I just look at a page and I see Walt Disney Presents the Mickey Mouse Club, Zorro, Darby O'Gill and the Little People, Pete's Dragon, Texas John Slaughter, Monkeys Go Home. I mean, you can't have gone through life and not have been a Disney fan at some point. You had to see something of Disney's work.
Well, that is the amazing thing, is that, I wasn't born until the mid-1960s, so I didn't see most of these things when they first came out. I rediscovered them discovered them for the first time in the 1980s and 90s when they started to release them on video and then on DVD and now online. And so you literally do have generations of people who have been impacted by these films and continue to be impacted by them.
Yeah, Daniel Boone, Davy Crockett. Oh my gosh, it just goes on and on. And I was born in '53 when they first started building out the Disney set, and Walt Disney Presents was part of my weekly fare. So I saw a lot of these as they were originally presented, but I can't tell you how many times I've seen Mary Poppins, but it's more times than I care to admit. and singing those songs with my son growing up. It's just his impact on our culture was just an amazing thing.
And I would say, if part of my book is a thematic exploration of the themes in Disney's live-action films. Part of it is on his biography and how he actually made the films. Part of it are production histories that you'll get nowhere else on how these films were made. Because I did talk to the writers, the producers, the directors, and in some cases some of the actors and actresses, and they told behind-the-scenes stories of how these things were made. So if anyone loves Zorro or Mary Poppins or 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea or Darby O'Gill or more obscure ones that no one has written about, this is the place to find information about it.
Yeah, I went through the various films and a little bit of history around each of them and realized that there's an awful lot that we don't know in the background, but the stories that he told were hypnotizing, just fascinating what he did with film and the action films. And that doesn't even count the animation. I mean, you mentioned,
that's true.
You mentioned Fantasia because there are live sequences in Fantasia, even though it's really starring Mickey.
Yeah. No, that's right. And those were actually some of his first live-action sequences that he did. But, he was I think one of the things he brought to the live-action was, it was very helpful that he had been an artist and an animator, because the sense of visuals. And so you mentioned something like 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea or Darby O'Gill and the Little People. Disney's, if people haven't seen that, I just encourage them to see that. The special effects in something like Darby O'Gill and the Little People, where you have all these leprechauns, where these massive sets were constructed for this, and a back lot was done, and they actually created sets for the village and things that many people thought was filmed, in Ireland, but in fact it wasn't. The stunning visuals and the special effects still are fresh today, and I would have to say that you pretty much cannot find another 1950s sort of fantasy film where you could say the same thing about, because in the era of digital effects we're so much better. But in Darby O'Gill they used something called forced perspective, and so they actually, it was fascinating how they did it. They tricked the camera, so you had, for the leprechauns, they were 3 times further back and further below than the other actors who were on a different level, and so they weren't actually splicing together the films in a way that looked hokey or not real. So even today, it looks sparkling, and that is something.
Yeah.
That quality.
It's a shame we can't talk more about the details of this because our time is up, but Sherman and Sherman, the composers of Mary Poppins and other films, said that this book is an exciting, revealing, and rewarding read for anyone who ever loved and was moved by a Walt Disney video, and I tend to agree. We've been talking with Dr. John West. His book is Walt Disney and Live Action, and it's a fascinating read, and it will prompt people to rent videos of Walt Disney's for quite some time to come. I'm your host, Dr. John Cook. I remind you, if you don't hear our regularly scheduled program at its scheduled time, you can catch us on YouTube at Good Books Radio, Strong and Cook. I'm your host, Dr. John Cook. Thanks for listening.